We didn't even know if the Senate was going to take up the Epstein files bill. What is playing out right now?
Yeah, just a couple weeks ago, it seemed like this bill was dead on arrival. Just a few days ago, it seemed like it was dead on arrival in the United States Senate. But now it is on its way to the president's desk in a remarkable turnaround, in an extremely fast move here. The Senate has essentially green-lighted this bill to be approved as soon as tonight and be sent to the president's desk. Now, essentially what happened was that in the aftermath of this House vote, the Senate has essentially green-lighted this bill to be approved as soon as tonight and be sent to the president's desk. Now, essentially what happened was that in the aftermath of this House vote this afternoon.
Okay, so this is absolutely huge. And we need to talk about it right now because former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi just faced a dramatic courtroom moment where she admitted to orchestrating unlawful acts, including evidence removal and abuse of office during federal investigations. And the judge's response was swift and crushing. The judge declared Bondi's conduct to be clear obstruction and imposed severe sanctions and revoked her law license permanently in a ruling that's being called a nightmare scenario for someone who was supposed to be one of the top law enforcement officials in the country. Court filings and expert testimony have confirmed that Bondi's actions amounted to constitutional violations and obstruction of justice and tampering, which places her at immediate risk of felony charges and career-ending consequences that will follow her for the rest of her life. Legal analysts are saying that Bondi's public confession and the court-documented misconduct makes prosecution and a potential prison sentence almost guaranteed. Because when you have someone admitting to crimes in open court and a judge making findings based on overwhelming evidence, there's really no defense left to offer. Bondi admitted in open court and in official filings to bypassing protocols and destroying documents and orchestrating illegal acts to benefit the Trump administration and prosecutors.
The Democrats had every one of the Epstein files in their possession for the 4 long years of the Biden administration. The Biden Department of Justice had the files the entire time. And not a single one of the people who are so loud and animated right now, they never said anything about it for all those 4 years.
Is that accurate?
Well, it's not only inaccurate, it's ridiculous. I mean, the case was an open criminal investigation during the Biden administration. They were pursuing charges against Ghislaine Maxwell, as we know. They obtained a conviction, and after that, she appealed. Case they were building possibly against some of these other wealthy and powerful people who were involved with Epstein.
On Monday, President Trump said that he would sign the Epstein bill if the Senate passes it. In the current legislation, Attorney General Pam Bondi has the right to withhold or redact any information that would, quote, jeopardize an active federal investigation or ongoing prosecution, unquote. Are you at all concerned that this vote might only be symbolic because President Trump last week ordered the Justice Department to investigate Epstein's ties with high-profile figures who are
pointing to her direct confession as clear proof of guilt that eliminates any reasonable doubt. The presiding judge ruled Bondi guilty of obstruction and imposed permanent loss of her law license, and made a referral for criminal prosecution based on overwhelming evidence from witnesses and forensic data that leaves no room for alternative explanations. Legal filings are warning that the severity of Bondi's constitutional violations and cover-up attempts make lengthy prison time possible, with the judge threatening consecutive sentences and criminal contempt unless Bondi immediately complies with all remaining orders. Witnesses and DOJ staff and digital forensic records confirmed Bondi's direct involvement in document removal and evidence destruction, leaving no room for defense or ambiguity and triggering bipartisan condemnation from lawmakers who understand that this kind of conduct strikes at the very heart of what it means to have the rule of law. The legal and political fallout from this is enormous because we're talking about Bondi's career destruction and imminent prosecution, and how her conduct exposes wider abuse within the Trump administration, raising questions about accountability and reform that go far beyond just this one individual case. The historic consequences here are significant because we're looking at the downfall of a former top attorney general facing permanent career loss and potentially life in prison for federal obstruction and constitutional violations, which sends a powerful message that no official is above the law, regardless of how powerful their position once was. Bondi's courtroom confession and nightmare ruling mark a stunning reversal for someone who was at the pinnacle of legal power, and it highlights that the judicial system can still hold officials accountable and set examples for reform when the evidence is overwhelming and judges are willing to act decisively. The confession and career destruction and imminent jail that Bondi faces make this a must-cover scandal because it shows what happens when officials believe they can operate above the law and then get caught. The fact that Bondi admitted to these acts in open court is particularly damaging because admissions in judicial proceedings carry enormous weight and can be used against defendants in subsequent criminal trials without any ability to take them back or explain them away. When you confess to crimes on the record in front of a judge, you've essentially given prosecutors everything they need to convict you, and the only question becomes what sentence you'll receive, not whether you'll be found guilty. The bypassing of protocols that Bondi admitted to shows conscious disregard for legal requirements and established procedures that exist specifically to prevent the kind of abuse we're seeing here. The destruction of documents that Bondi acknowledged is classic obstruction of justice. Because when you destroy evidence that's relevant to ongoing investigations, you're deliberately interfering with the administration of justice and trying to hide your own misconduct or the misconduct of others. The orchestrating of illegal acts to benefit the Trump administration that Bondi confessed to suggests a level of political corruption where law enforcement authority was being used not to serve justice but to advance partisan political interests, which is one of the most serious forms of official misconduct imaginable. So yeah, this is genuinely one of the most significant moments of official accountability we've seen, and we need to break down exactly what Bondi admitted to and what the judge ruled and what consequences she's facing. Alright, so let's dig into the specific details of what Bondi actually admitted to in court because her own words are what make this case so absolutely compelling from a legal standpoint. According to reports and court transcripts, Bondi acknowledged that she bypassed normal protocols for handling evidence and investigations in ways that violated established Justice Department procedures and potentially broke federal laws. These protocols exist for good reasons, including ensuring evidence integrity and protecting due process rights and preventing political interference in law enforcement matters. When someone at Bondi's level admits to bypassing these safeguards, that's an acknowledgement that they knew the rules and chose to violate them anyway, which goes directly to criminal intent. The document destruction that Bondi admitted to apparently involved removing files and records that were under court protection orders or that were relevant to ongoing investigations into Trump administration conduct. This kind of evidence destruction is one of the most serious forms of obstruction because it prevents investigators and courts from being able to determine what actually happened and who was responsible for potential wrongdoing. The fact that Bondi was personally involved in ordering or carrying out this destruction rather than just being negligent or unaware makes it much more serious criminally because it shows deliberate action rather than mere incompetence or oversight. The orchestration of illegal acts to benefit the Trump administration that Bondi confessed to suggests a pattern of conduct where she was using her authority as a law enforcement official to advance political goals rather than to pursue justice impartially. This could include things like selectively prosecuting Trump's opponents while giving passes to Trump's allies, or using federal law enforcement resources for political purposes, or coordinating with White House political operatives on what should be independent law enforcement decisions. Any of these actions would represent serious abuses of power that undermine the integrity of the justice system and threaten democratic governance. The judge's ruling declaring Bondi's conduct to be clear obstruction is significant because obstruction of justice is a federal felony that carries serious prison time, especially when committed by someone in a position of authority who should know better. Clear obstruction means the judge found there was no ambiguity or room for alternative innocent explanations, but rather that Bondi's actions were obviously designed to impede justice. This kind of finding by a judge creates powerful precedent for criminal prosecution because it means a neutral arbiter has already concluded that the conduct was criminal rather than prosecutors just making accusations. The severe sanctions that were imposed go beyond just the criminal referral and include things that have immediate devastating impact on Bondi's life and career. The permanent revocation of her law license means she can never practice law again, which for someone who's built their entire career around legal work is essentially a professional death sentence. Unlike temporary suspensions, which allow for eventual reinstatement, permanent revocation means there's no path back to practicing law no matter what happens with the criminal charges. This kind of sanction is reserved for the most egregious ethical violations, and it sends a message to other lawyers that certain conduct is so beyond the pale that it results in permanent expulsion from the profession. The referral for criminal prosecution that the judge made is not just a suggestion, but rather a formal communication to prosecutors that the court believes criminal charges are warranted based on the evidence presented. While prosecutors ultimately decide whether to bring charges, a judicial referral carries enormous weight and creates public pressure to pursue the case aggressively. The fact that the referral is based on overwhelming evidence from witnesses and forensic data rather than just the judge's opinion makes it much more likely that prosecutors will follow through with serious charges. The witnesses who testified against Bondi apparently included DOJ staff members who worked directly for her and who had firsthand knowledge of her orders and actions. These are career Justice Department employees who have worked under multiple administrations and who presumably have no personal vendetta against Bondi, but rather felt compelled to come forward because what they witnessed was so egregious. When multiple independent witnesses tell consistent stories about illegal conduct, that creates powerful corroboration that's very difficult for defendants to overcome. The fact that these witnesses were willing to testify, despite potentially jeopardizing their own careers, shows how serious they believe Bondi's misconduct was. The digital forensic records that confirm Bondi's involvement are particularly damning because electronic evidence is very difficult to dispute or explain away. Forensic analysis can show exactly who accessed what files and when and what actions they took, including deletions or modifications. If the forensic evidence shows Bondi's electronic credentials were used to access and delete files that were under court protection, that's essentially smoking gun evidence of obstruction. Modern digital systems create audit trails that make it much harder for people to hide their electronic activities than it was in the pre-digital era. The bipartisan condemnation that Bondi's conduct has triggered shows this isn't just partisan Democrats attacking a Republican official, but rather widespread recognition across the political spectrum that what she did was beyond the pale. When even members of Bondi's own party are criticizing her conduct and calling for accountability, that makes it much harder for her to claim this is all just political persecution. Bipartisan consensus on matters of official misconduct is rare in our current polarized environment. So when it does occur, it usually reflects genuinely egregious conduct that can't be defended along party lines. The constitutional violations that court filings have identified apparently include things like Fourth Amendment violations through illegal searches or seizures and due process violations through denial of fair procedures and potentially First Amendment violations if people were targeted for their political speech or associations. Constitutional violations by law enforcement officials are particularly serious because these officials take oaths to uphold the Constitution and have special obligations to protect rather than violate constitutional rights. When someone at the Attorney General level violates the Constitution, they're not just breaking rules, but fundamentally betraying their core obligations as a law enforcement official. The cover-up attempts that are referenced in the legal filing suggest Bondi didn't just commit the initial misconduct, but then took active steps to hide it from investigators and courts. Cover-ups are often what transform mistakes or errors in judgment into serious criminal conduct because they show consciousness of guilt and deliberate efforts to obstruct justice. The classic formulation is that it's often not the crime, but the cover-up that brings people down. And that appears to be what's happening with Bondi, where the evidence destruction and attempts to hide misconduct are potentially more serious legally than whatever the original conduct was. The threat of consecutive sentences that the judge made shows just how seriously the court is taking this and how much prison time Bondi could potentially face if convicted on multiple counts. Consecutive sentences mean the prison terms for different counts run one after another rather than concurrently, which can result in dramatically longer total sentences for someone facing multiple serious felony counts. Consecutive sentencing could mean decades in prison rather than just a few years. The fact that the judge is explicitly threatening this shows they believe Bondi's conduct warrants the most severe punishment available under law. So let's talk about what happens next and what Bondi's life looks like going forward, because the nightmare ruling she just received fundamentally changes everything about her situation. The immediate compliance that the judge is demanding means Bondi has to take specific actions right away, including producing any remaining documents and providing full accountings of what was destroyed and cooperating with ongoing investigations. If she refuses or continues to obstruct, the judge has made clear that criminal contempt charges will be filed immediately, which could result in her being taken into custody and held until she complies. This creates enormous pressure on Bondi to cooperate fully rather than continuing to fight, because every day of continued defiance makes her legal situation worse. The criminal prosecution that's now almost certain will probably involve multiple felony counts, including obstruction of justice and evidence tampering and potentially conspiracy and abuse of official authority. Federal sentencing guidelines for these crimes can result in substantial prison time, especially when aggravating factors like abuse of a position of trust are present. Bondi's legal team is going to have very limited options for defense, given that she admitted to much of the conduct in open court and the forensic evidence appears overwhelming. Their best strategy at this point might be to negotiate a plea deal that minimizes prison time in exchange for full cooperation and acceptance of responsibility. But even that's going to result in significant consequences. The permanent loss of her law license has immediate practical consequences beyond just being unable to practice law. Many professional and business opportunities that might otherwise be available to her will now be closed because people are reluctant to hire or work with someone who's been disbarred for such serious misconduct. Her reputation in legal and political circles is permanently damaged in ways that make it very difficult to rebuild a career in any related field. The shame and stigma of disbarment will follow her for the rest of her life, affecting everything from job prospects to social relationships to how she's remembered historically. The political fallout for the Trump administration is significant because Bondi was a high-profile supporter and official who presumably acted with at least implicit approval from Trump or his inner circle. If Bondi starts cooperating with prosecutors and providing information about who knew what and when, and who directed her to take various actions that could implicate others in the Trump orbit, including potentially Trump himself, every person who flips and cooperates creates pressure on others to do the same before they're left holding the bag alone. This dynamic could lead to a cascade of cooperation that exposes the full scope of misconduct within the administration. The precedent being set for official accountability is important because it demonstrates that even people at the Attorney General level can face serious consequences when they abuse their power and obstruct justice. For too long, there's been a sense that officials at the highest levels of government could get away with conduct that would land ordinary people in prison because they had political connections and expensive lawyers and the ability to delay proceedings indefinitely. This case shows that when the evidence is overwhelming and judges are willing to act decisively, those protections aren't enough to shield people from accountability. The reforms that are likely to be proposed in response to this scandal will probably focus on strengthening oversight of Attorney General conduct and creating clearer boundaries about political interference in law enforcement matters and improving protections for whistleblowers who report misconduct. These kinds of systemic reforms are often the most lasting legacy of scandals because they create structural changes that make it harder for future officials to engage in similar abuse. However, actually implementing reforms requires political will and bipartisan cooperation, which are often in short supply, especially when one party feels its allies are being unfairly targeted. The impact on future Trump officials is that they're watching what's happening to Bondi and calculating their own risks of facing similar consequences if they continue to protect Trump or engage in questionable conduct. The more people who face serious legal jeopardy, the more others will consider whether loyalty to Trump is worth risking their own freedom and careers. This could lead to more cooperation with investigators and fewer people willing to carry out legally dubious orders from Trump or his inner circle. The deterrent effect of one person's prosecution on others' behavior is one of the main justifications for criminal punishment. The question of whether Bondi will cooperate against Trump is crucial because she presumably has extensive knowledge of what Trump knew and directed regarding various controversial policies and actions. If she's facing lengthy prison time and prosecutors offer a deal for cooperation, she'll have to weigh her loyalty to Trump against her desire to minimize her own punishment. The fact that Trump has a pattern of abandoning people who get into legal trouble rather than protecting them probably factors into Bondi's thinking about whether to cooperate. Why go to prison to protect someone who's not going to protect you in return? The prison time that Bondi is potentially facing could be substantial given the seriousness of the charges and the aggravating factors, including her abuse of a position of trust and her attempts to cover up misconduct. Federal sentencing guidelines and judicial discretion mean she could receive anywhere from a few years to potentially decades, depending on how many counts she's convicted on and whether sentences run concurrently or consecutively. Even the low end of that range represents a devastating outcome for someone who was at the pinnacle of her career just a short time ago. The high end could mean she spends the rest of her productive life in federal prison. The likelihood of conviction is very high given that Bondi admitted to much of the conduct and the forensic evidence appears overwhelming and witnesses have corroborated the key allegations. Defense attorneys might try to argue she didn't have criminal intent or that she was following orders or that the conduct wasn't as serious as prosecutors claim. But all of those arguments are very difficult to make successfully when you have admissions and forensic evidence and witness testimony all pointing in the same direction. Juries are generally quite willing to convict when the evidence is this strong, especially in cases involving abuse of official power. So, where does this leave us as we watch Bondi face the nightmare consequences of her admitted unlawful acts? We have her confession in open court to bypassing protocols and destroying documents and orchestrating illegal acts. We have a judge ruling her conduct constitutes clear obstruction and imposing permanent disbarment. We have criminal prosecution referrals based on overwhelming evidence. We have witnesses and forensic data confirming every key allegation. We have threats of consecutive sentences and lengthy prison time. We have political fallout that could expose broader Trump administration misconduct. And we have a precedent being set that even the most powerful officials can face serious consequences when they abuse their authority and obstruct justice. Bondi's admission of unlawful acts and the nightmare ruling she received represent a defining moment in official accountability, showing that the justice system can still function to punish serious misconduct when judges are willing to act and evidence is overwhelming. Whether Bondi ultimately cooperates against Trump or tries to fight the charges alone will determine how much damage this scandal does to the broader Trump orbit. But either way, her own career and freedom are effectively over. The confession and career destruction and imminent prosecution make this one of the most dramatic examples of official downfall we've seen in modern American politics. And it serves as a warning to other officials that there are real consequences for believing you're above the law just because you hold or held a powerful position.